Okay, as we get back into the book of Romans today, why we understand the first 8 chapters was showing that God made the Gentiles equal with the Jews, and of course this boggled the minds of the Jews, and so now then Paul in chapters 9 through 11 is telling the Jews how and why God did this. Now this is an interesting section of Romans. Although it's a section that we very seldom go to when we're preaching or teaching and so forth, because it was a great big deal to those people, but it's not such a big deal to you and me. How many of you in here today are really wondering and concerned, stayed up last night thinking about, how could God make a Gentile equal with a Jew? Now, how much time does that consume in your daily life worrying about that? And you say, well, I've known that all my life. I mean, I'd never even give it a thought. And that's true. But to those Jews back there, that was the major thing in their life. If I become a Christian, and the evidence is that Jesus is the Christ, but if I become a Christian, that means that the Jew and the Gentiles are on the same par. And I just don't see how that can happen. God chose the Jews hundreds of years ago, and now then all of a sudden, He's rejected the Jews, and He's accepted the Gentiles in on the same level as a Jew. It just doesn't make sense how God can do that. So it was a big problem. Paul then, in the Roman letter, spends 9, 10, and 11, these chapters, dealing with that very thing and showing them that. Now, as we started out today, we're going to be down really in verse 14. Now, as you take a look at that, we started out and in verses 1 through 5, Paul says, I love the Jews. I'm not saying these things because I don't love Jews. Then he went ahead and he says in verse 6, on down through verse 13, he said, but I want you to understand something. And that is that God has choices in this life. God makes choices. And then he showed in their own genealogy. God chose Abraham and made a promise to Abraham. And then when Abraham had 2 boys, God chose the younger boy over the older boy. And then when he had 2 sons, God did the same thing. Now, why did God do that? And Paul is saying God did it arbitrarily. God did it before the boys had done anything good or bad. God says, this is what I'm going to do. So now, we're down today then to, actually in verse 14, we talked about a few of these verses, but here in verse 14, is all this arbitrary selection by God fair? Is it fair for God to make these kind of selections? And so, as I've already pointed out, this section of Romans is showing that these people are merely instruments of God's overall plan. God had a plan before He ever created the heavens and the earth. Abraham was just an instrument in God's plan. Regardless of how great a man Abraham is, and he's the father of the faithful, he still was just a human instrument in the overall plan of God. That God's plan was to save mankind through Jesus Christ. And so when Abraham had his boys, God chose his boys, whichever one He wanted. They were just instruments that God used. God could have used any instrument that He wanted to use. And so that's what this section really is about. So is it fair? Is God fair in doing this? He said, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? God forbid. That's that word that means absolutely not, so far out, don't even consider it. For He saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it is not him that willeth, nor him that runneth, but God that hath mercy. So Paul is saying, God told Moses this one time. Now, again, I want to emphasize, this has nothing to do with salvation. I'll show mercy upon whom I'll show mercy, and I'll show wrath on whom I'll show wrath. Has nothing to do with salvation. It has to do with the normal things of life. God had cursed some of the people, some of the Jewish people. He had killed many of them. And then Moses asked God for a favor. Moses asked him to be able to see him. And God then says, you know what, Moses? You can't see me and live. So I'm not going to let you see me because I am so powerful that if you see me, the human cannot live if they see God. But he said, I will have mercy on whom I'll have mercy. Here's what I'm going to do with you. Now, did Moses need any mercy at this time? If you're in Wednesday night class, you remember what kind of trouble did the Jews give Moses? Just one after the other. And Moses would come to God and God, if you're going to do this, then just wipe me out too. Just take my life. It's such a burden, I can't stand it. And Moses needed some evidence. And God says, okay, I'll have mercy on whom I'll have mercy. Moses, I'm going to let you see my glory. That's the subject that you've got in here. Then he goes ahead and he said, now I want you to understand, it's not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that hath mercy. So when you start asking questions, why did God choose Abraham? Why did God choose Isaac or Jacob? Why did God choose Pharaoh to raise him up and then to destroy him? Why did God? Why did God? Why did God? Why did God? How many questions could we make over the years of why did God do this? Why did God raise up the country of Iran? If you were God, would you have raised up Iran and let those people run that country over there? Why did God raise up China? Why did God raise up? And so you start looking at all the countries around about. Now, of course, you and I know who's the greatest country on this earth. Yeah. Why didn't God just raise us up? See, why did God? Do you suppose God has a plan? You see, do you suppose God knows what He's doing? Now, when Nebuchadnezzar asked that question, you remember he was out on the porch and he asked that question. What was it that God told him? He said, "You're going to learn a lesson," and he said, "You're going to learn a lesson that God rules in the kingdom of men, and I raise up whom I will, and I destroy whom I will." You're going to learn that lesson. Now, is that true really in our forthcoming election? We could make some applications there, couldn't we? But that's not our question. That's not our lesson today. It's why does God do these things? All right, Paul said, here's the principle I want you to understand. It is not of him that willeth. Now, here it is. I have desires. Do you have any desires about who you would like to win the election? Yeah, you have some desires about, I'd like to see this guy. That's not the basis on which God's going to make it. It's not of him that willeth or of him that runneth. It's not the guy that can run the fastest. It's not the guy that can beat in a race. It's God. God has plans, and God will fulfill His plans. That's what these chapters right in here are about. Now, out of all the people in the world, God chose Abraham. From Abraham, God's two sons, God chose Isaac. And from Isaac's two sons, God chose Jacob. Just arbitrary choosing in that way. Then He uses even Pharaoh. And He shows that God chose even Gentile kings and men to bring about this purpose. And so He raised up Pharaoh for a purpose. His purpose was to show His power. We talked about that this last week, about that power that we've got there. God hardened His heart, and He also hardened His own heart. Now, I put that in there so that the question always comes up. God raised up Pharaoh, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that Pharaoh was mean. Now, that doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair for God to raise up a man to be a Pharaoh and then harden his heart so he became mean like Pharaoh was mean. Okay? Well, there's more to the story than that. And that's the reason that I have it here, is to show, no, God didn't act in that particular way that is in there. Now, first of all, God hardened his heart. As you see in there, he says, which I put in my hands, but I will harden his heart, and he will not let my people go. So God says, I'll harden his heart, and he'll not let my people go. Now, last week I used Matt as an illustration of I could harden his heart. I see Matt not with us today. He's afraid I'd do something to him, I guess, and so he left. You make sure you tell him that, Deb. Okay? And so if you do this, well, we can use Steve. He's sitting in the same place right there. I can harden Steve's heart. See? I said, Steve, let's go out to breakfast in the morning. Every once in a while, I reach up and just flick him on the nose. What's Steve going to do? And he's going to say, don't do that or something. And I keep. Will there be a breaking point of somewhere that he says, that's enough, I'm out of here, or do something? See, I can harden his heart that's in there and make him do something. Now, God says, I'm going to harden his heart. Now, here's the key in this whole thing. God doesn't harden a man's heart unless that man is willing for it to be hardened. Now, if Steve is so nice and he's so good that you can't irritate him, you can't make Steve mad at me. Doesn't make any difference what I do. You can't make him mad at me. That's the kind of guy he is. Can I harden his heart? No. I can't harden his heart then and make him do something. But please believe me, he's not that kind of guy. I can harden his heart, see? And I can irritate him, and I can get him to then come and say, okay, that's enough, or see, do something. So God raised up this guy, and this guy had an ugly heart. He had an ugly heart, and so God used these 10 plagues, these miracles, to make him mad and to harden his heart. Now look, watch right here. Now there it is. God says, I'm going to harden his heart. But now then, we have over in Exodus 8:15, and it said, and when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart. See? So Pharaoh hardened his heart, and hearkened not unto them as Jehovah had spoken. And so don't think that when God hardened his heart, he did it in a miraculous way. Don't look at this and say, okay, God raised up poor old Pharaoh, and then God hardened his heart, gave him a hard heart, and then God condemned him and killed his son, and God did all of this, and God was unfair. That's Paul's point. He said, you're missing the point if you look at that. God works with men the way men actually are in there. It tells us the heart of Pharaoh was stubborn, and he wouldn't let the people go. So here's a guy that God is using because the guy is mean. He's stubborn. He's a hard-headed guy. You're not going to tell him anything, but that's what God is doing. God is telling him these things that's in there. And finally, God told him, he said, now, Pharaoh, I've made you to stand to show my power. He said, I wanted to do this. I've raised you up and I've done this, but I'm telling you why I'm treating you this way, Pharaoh. I'm doing it to show the people my power. And then he goes ahead to say, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth, as yet exaltest thou thyself against my people, that thou wilt not let them go? Now when you see my power, and you understand the reason I'm doing this is to show my power, and you understand that I have the power over the whole earth, and yet you exalt your heart above me, and you still won't let them go, God did everything he could do talking to Pharaoh to try to get Pharaoh to be the kind of man that he ought to be. Pharaoh's a hard-hearted man, and God used him in that sense. So, we got this. So we learn God has always raised up, accepted, and rejected men, kings, and all of this to bring Christ into the world. Now the Jewish nation, here's the big thing. This is the big shocker. This is hard for people to understand. this is hard for people to understand today. The Jewish nation was just one more instrument out of these many things. That's what God is telling them. But people, even today, say, no, the Jewish nation is the most important thing there is, and so we have to stand by that in every way. Now, we're down now to new material here. Now, God chose Abraham, God chose Isaac, God chose Jacob, God chose Pharaoh. Then verse 20, Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why didst thou make me thus? Or hath not the potter the right over the clay from the same lump to make one part a vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? So he said, I want you to understand, this is God's power over the whole world. It's just like a potter over clay. Now, you might not know it. You know Oliver's a potter, but did you know I'm also a potter? I haven't bragged about my abilities as a potter, but I am a potter. And you say, well, how'd this come to pass, Lowell? Well, this last summer, Oliver sat me down and said, Lowell, let me show you how to make a bowl. So I sat down and how do you turn on the machine, see? And he showed me how to make a little bowl, and I made a little bowl. So I'm a potter that's there. Now, the interesting thing is that as we sat down, Oliver, he looks over, and he sees my great abilities. And so he wants to get the best clay because he doesn't want to get something that it takes some skill to work with. So he wants to get some of the good clay where you don't have to have any skills. And so he picks up some clay. He starts, he throws it down. He said, let's put that one down. Let's get some. And so he goes and he gets some new clay. Who gave him the right to do that? Who gave Oliver the right to throw that lump of clay down? Now, he set it aside, and he's going to work on it, see? He's going to make something out of it. But here it is, he got out this real nice, new, pliable chunk of clay for me to work with. Would that lump of clay look up at Oliver? Why'd you throw me over here? That's not fair for you to throw me over here. You say, that's stupid. That's what Paul is saying right here. That would be stupid, see, in doing that. And yet, Oliver could answer it. If the clay did say that, what could Oliver have turned around and said to the clay? Clay, you're not made of the kind of stuff I need. See, you're too hard. You're too, whatever it was he saw wrong with that clay. You're not made out of the right stuff. So you're over there. So I'm going to use this to make this particular thing. That's what God does. That's the reason God used the right man to raise up Pharaoh. He uses the right people for the job. Now, he said in here, you got to look at it just as a matter of a potter over clay. Now, when Oliver makes something, you go out, his whole office out there is filled full of different things. So you look up and you say, Oliver, now this right here is a nice bowl, but this up here is something. Why did you make that? Right? Well, it's because he wanted to make it. Well, what kind of clay did he make it out of? He made it out of the kind of clay that is the best for that particular thing, see? And so he can explain that to you, and he can say, no, here it is, and he told me, no, if we make it out of this, Lowell, and you do this, then when I glaze it over and so forth, it's going to crack, and it's going to do this. That lump of clay was not worth making that bowl out of. Now, as Oliver has charge of that clay, God says, so does God have charge of everything in this world. Now, let me show you something again. And that is that if we read these two verses in here, Jeremiah 18 and Isaiah 45, we learn that God doesn't do this just arbitrarily. God doesn't just take a vessel of some kind and just throw it away. He doesn't do that is in there. Well, what do you suppose Oliver would do if he had let me make that bowl out of that old clay? So I made a bowl, and it really looked nice. And he's getting ready now to put it in the oven. But he looks and he sees all the inferior things that's in it. And he knows that if he puts it in the oven and starts to heat it up, that bowl is going to crack. What do you suppose Oliver would do with that bowl? He'd throw it away, wouldn't he? See? He'd toss it away because it's not worth anything. That's what Paul is going to tell us, or what Jeremiah is going to tell us about God. Let's look at this for just a moment. So we won't get the idea that God just arbitrarily just makes these decisions. It said, the word which came to Jeremiah from Jehovah, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there will I cause thee to hear my words. When I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he was making a work on the wheels, and when the vessel that he had made of clay was marred in the hands of the potter, he made it again unto another vessel. So you see, this clay was marred. It wasn't the right kind of clay. It was like Oliver, he just could feel the clay and throw it away. No, we don't make bowls out of this. We make something else out of it. So it said when he's marred there, he made again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. Then the word of Jehovah came to me, saying, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter, saith Jehovah? Behold, as the clay in the potter's hand, so are ye in my hand, O house of Israel. Now, how many years before Christ did God tell Jeremiah this thing? See, 600 years before Christ, God told through Jeremiah, Israel, here's what I want you to know that you are. See, this is what you are. You're nothing more than a clay in a potter's hand. Then he goes and he explains about that clay and about Israel. He said, At what instant I shall speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to pluck up and break down and to destroy it. If that nation concerning which I have spoken turn from their evil, I will repent, that means change my mind, of the evil or the bad thing that I thought to do unto them. And at what instant I shall speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom to build and plant it. If they do that which is evil in my sight, that they obey not my voice, then I will repent of the good wherewith I said I would benefit them. So I said, now I want you to tell Israel this. God told Israel this 600 years before Christ. I want you to know, Israel, that you are nothing more than mud in my hand. And just like a potter makes these decisions, so I make the decision. And he said, here's what I work on. I don't just make bad stuff. See, I don't make bad stuff and then condemn people because they're bad. He said, I want you to know, whenever I talk to a nation and tell a nation, I'm going to pluck you up. I'm going to tear you down. If that nation will change, then I will change and I'll keep that nation. And on the other hand, when I tell a nation that I'm going to establish it and make it firm, that's what he told Israel, wasn't it? That I'm going to get you. If they do evil, then what will I do to them? Then I'll throw them away. Now, roll your mind 600 years into the future, at 70 AD. When God destroyed Jerusalem, was that just a one-day event that God decided, God got mad and said, I'm going to destroy Jerusalem in 70 AD? Or had God been telling them, this is the basis on which I work? See, this is the basis on which I work. And then he warned and warned and warned and warned, telling them, you're not pleasing and you're going to be destroyed. So, Paul is showing God doesn't just work arbitrarily in here. Then he explains in verses 22 through 29 the truth, the real purpose. God is working out his eternal plan. He shows his wrath and destruction to make his power known. That's the reason God does such things as these. Why does God destroy such great nations? To make his power known. He does it so people can see how great he is. He destroyed Assyria. He destroyed Babylon. He destroyed the Pharaoh. Why does God use His wrath in such a way that people can see it? To make His power known. That's what Paul is saying. So now, you look down here then, and in verse 22. Now what if God, willing to show His wrath, now God will show His wrath, and to make His power known, endureth with much long suffering vessels of wrath, fitted unto destruction, and that He might make known the riches of His glory upon the vessels of mercy, which He afore prepared unto His glory. So now, here's what God is doing. And I don't know how to put it. God is doing exactly what we think, exactly opposite of what we think God is doing. We'll put it that way. As God is doing these things, mankind looks and mankind sees one thing, but God is doing exactly the opposite of what we see Him doing. Now, when we see God exerting His wrath, when we see God destroying the strongest nation on earth, Assyria and Nebuchadnezzar, and He does it overnight, what do you see? What do we see in that? We see in that, wow, look how God destroyed. And then He did the same thing with Babylon. God destroyed. And then He did the same thing with Pharaoh. God destroyed. And then He comes down to do the same thing with the Jews in Jerusalem, 70 A.D. You read about that. Most horrible destruction that ever took place. Well, God destroyed. Now, that's not what God wants us to see. That's my point. That's not what He wants us to see. What God wants us to see is how good He is, how merciful He is, how long-suffering He is, and yet how powerful He is to carry out His will. That's what He's wanting us to see. And so oftentimes we only see His wrath. When He said, I want you to see my goodness. Let's read it again. What if God, willing to show His wrath, now He's willing to let you see His wrath, and to make His power known, now here's the key, endured with much long suffering vessels of wrath fitted unto destruction. What should we see? See, that's the key. What should we see? When you see Nebuchadnezzar, God and Nebuchadnezzar, here's what I see. I see a powerful God that just blasted him out, destroyed that nation overnight. That's what I see. But I don't see what God really wants me to see. What God really wants me to see is that how long did He endure Assyria? How long did He permit them to rule the world? How long did He permit them to do all of these ungodly things before He destroyed them? His long-suffering. In His long-suffering, we're to see His long-suffering, His mercy, and then we can see His power. But God endured. He didn't like it. He endured all of that ungodly nation, of all of these nations that He destroyed. What if we look at nations today? Some of these that are genocide, killing their citizens, horrible leaders that are in there. And we see that and we say, how could God permit it? How could He not do something about it? Instead of saying, look at the long suffering of God. God is permitting this nation to kill sometimes 2 or 3 million of its citizens and doesn't destroy the leader. Just shake your head. You say, why would He do that? You know, it might be because He's long suffering, because He's trying to carry out a plan that you and I don't see. But then when He gets ready to destroy, does He have the power to destroy? Oh boy, you see, then it goes. Now these were all people and nations fitted for destruction. All of them needed to be destroyed. Are there nations in the world today that need to be destroyed? Yeah, there's nations that need to be destroyed. And why didn't God destroy them? His long suffering, His loving care. It's more than I can understand. See, if I were God, I'd just zap everybody but Americans out. Then I'd start down the road and bing, I'd start. And probably I'd be the only one left when you get through with the thing. But that's not God. See, that's not the way that God operates, that is in there. Now, God took these men out. They were fitted for destruction. And so was physical Israel. Physical Israel was fitted for destruction. If you go back and you read Matthew 24, it tells about the destruction of Israel. Now, God had warned them over and over and over and over again through the prophets that if you don't turn, I'll destroy you. But now then, when we get down to 70 A.D., by this time Israel has become so inwardly corrupt, they have rejected the Messiah that God sent. They have tried to kill him. They've tried to destroy the church. And when Jesus spoke in Matthew 24, he said, now watch for the Roman government. And he's telling the Christians. He said, watch for the Roman government, and when you see it coming, you head out of town. And then he says, for where the carcass is, there will the eagles or the vultures be also. That's a big verse for us to think about today. He said, here's the reason I want you to get out of town. When you see the Romans coming against Jerusalem, don't you think that Jerusalem and the Jews are going to win this battle against Rome? Nope, it's over. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So you run, get out of town. He said, because it's just like this. Where the carcass is, wherever you find a dead animal, the carcass is there. You look up in the air, what do you see? You see the buzzards going around. So when you're driving down the road and you look out and you see 8 or 10 buzzards circling, what do you know is down there? See? Where the eagles are, there's where the carcass is. And so it is that Rome was coming in to destroy Jerusalem, the Jews, because they were dead. The nation was dead. It was rotten. It was a decayed nation. And so what he's telling the Jews, God is just operating upon this basis because it's the real, true basis to operate on. So then we learn the truth is that he endured much suffering. His wrath, his long suffering, his destruction was all for the purpose of showing mercy. Next week, we're going to be getting into then talking about the same thing, but off of this into another situation. Okay, class dismissed.